Welcome to the Convergence podcast. I'm your host, Ashok Sivanand. On this show, we'll deconstruct the best practices, principles, and the underlying philosophies behind the most engaged product teams who ship the most successful products. This is what teams are made of. Welcome back, folks, to another episode of Convergence.fm. We're going to do things just a little bit differently today. We've been getting a series of questions either on DMs or on our website, or even get sent Reddit links of pressing topics that are out there. And we're going to take some time, first of all, to thank our audience members for sending those in. They certainly help us with thinking through some of the things a little bit more, and I appreciate them a lot. And also, we're going to take time to reflect back on some of the things that we've done here at Integral, the things that I've worked on, to try and provide some perspective on these pressing questions. We're going to cover topics, everything from vibe coding to what happens when a really critical engineering member all of a sudden quits and takes another job somewhere, through to thinking about who your target customer is and whether you're going to build a very bespoke self-service tool or a full-service offering. And they're based on questions from you. So thank you again for your questions. And for the first time ever on Convergence, we have our producer, Doug Branson, joining us. So say hi to Doug and hope you find these helpful. Subscribe to the podcast to get future episodes as soon as they're published. If you find this helpful, give the podcast a 5-star rating on your podcast app or hit that like button on YouTube.
All right, this question is from Property Difficult 270 on the Product Management Reddit page, and the title of the post is "Our lead engineer quit and the whole company went into mini panic mode." Last month, our lead engineer left for another company. He'd been with the product for 8 years, and everyone relied on him for everything. At first, I thought, okay, we'll manage somehow. But then I started getting messages like this from customer support. A customer is asking about this error message. Now, before this engineer left, it would be Slack him and get an answer in 5 minutes. Now, it was engineers digging through code going, maybe this? And then this message from the sales team. I'm in a meeting. Can this feature do X, Y, and Z? Before he left, it would be yes, but watch out for A, B, C, and you would get an instant reply. Now it's let me investigate and I'll get back to you tomorrow. The worst part is seeing the engineering team burning out. Business teams are getting hesitant too, but they need answers to do their job, and the engineers' work stops every time they ask. How do you prevent this kind of single point of failure? Also, how much do you expect non-engineers to understand about how the product actually works?
That is a tough situation, unfortunately. And furthermore, it's one that I think a lot of teams get into. I've been on teams that have been in similar situations, and single points of failure like this are super high risk, especially when the impact are like what this team is seeing here, all the way from customer support to sales, and your customers are starting to feel the pain and not just the burned out engineering team. This tends to happen a lot when there's someone who's been on the team for a long time and they are the go-to, always, everything, I think is what I heard in the question. I've got some painkillers for you as to hopefully firefight your way and fix this in the short term and make the pain less, but also some vitamins to help avoid this pain in the future. On the painkiller side, I would say every time someone's got to go in and try and find an answer to this, you got to get good about documentation. My favorite form of documentation actually is unit tests, so that they are live. They help you with a series of other things, but especially in this case, anybody that's reading a certain part of the code and understands something, if they're able to document it, maybe write some tests around it, that then someone else coming in to read it or modify this part of the code later is going to have a way easier job. So documentation and unit tests are the first part of the painkiller. Another thing I would say is using AI-assisted code tools. Maybe your team's not using them to write code just as yet, but using them to read code could be a good way to step your way into getting familiar with these tools. And also, I've seen this time and time again amongst engineers that I work with, that reading legacy code or hard to read code is a lot easier for the computers and AI than it can be for humans. And then you can have a human conversation like you were maybe were with someone who's familiar with the code using the Copilots and other chatbots that exist within either GitHub Copilot, Windsurf, Cursor, whatever AI assisted tool is easiest for you to get access to today. So that's another painkiller, I would say. In terms of vitamins and how do we prevent this pain from ever happening again at your company, it's not going to be easy and it's going to take a little bit of discipline and consistency like vitamins, but it's a solution that I've seen time and time again for the teams that have the good habits, never have this firefighting situation that you're in. The first one is doing pull requests or code reviews where peers are looking at the code, ideally some part of some system. So before you can check in a piece of code into production or upgrade it to staging or whatever, someone else comes in and reads the code and approves it. And this immediately doubles the number of people who are familiar with the code that's now being created. An extreme version of this from the extreme programming playbook is pair programming, where every line of code is written by two people. And while pair programming is not necessarily the most efficient, especially in this day of using code assistance, I would think that a team like this could benefit from pairing or even mob programming, where more than two people are answering customer support questions, sales questions, modifying the code, because you're really increasing the surface area of how many people on your engineering team are familiar with the code. So you're not recreating this issue of a silo or a single point of failure where only one person knows how to do it. An extension to that, if you have multiple teams, is having people rotate across the teams and developing better context, not just on the part of the code base that your team is, but you maybe go spend a few weeks helping someone on another part of your engineering team check in code, and you bring a bunch of context from your part of the code base so you can maybe integrate better, but you're also helping normalize the coding standards and the practices and creating more readable code as an organization altogether. And then the third thing I think is it seems like this person who's left has created like an unsustainable set of expectations with customer support, with sales and so forth, where they used to provide real-time answers. Maybe your customers aren't expecting real-time answers as much as it's ideal for everybody. Maybe they're willing to wait one business day or a few hours. And having some kind of an agreement between the engineering team as well as customer support with sales or maybe even strategy and leadership in terms of how quickly you can get back to someone with a question, unless it is actually a red alert question that needs everything to be stopped and answered, allows for the engineering team to plan their days out just a little bit better. And I know that can also significantly reduce burnout on your team if the engineers have some level of autonomy around when they're answering questions, when they're able to get into a little bit more of a deep focus or flow state and solve creative problems, and then when they have to solve bugs or when they have to traverse code. So giving them a little bit less context switching and authority to plan their days by having more reasonable expectations might be another thing that has a little bit of short-term pain and investment, but can over time build a much more sustainable system across your product and customer teams. Fostering an engaged product organization and aligning them with the principles around lean, human-centered design, and agile will more than likely lead to successful business outcomes for your organization. But getting started or getting unblocked can be hard. This podcast is brought to you by the player coaches over at Integral. They help ambitious companies like you build amazing product teams and ship products in artificial intelligence, cloud, web, and mobile. Listeners to the podcast can head on over to integral.io/convergence and get a free product success lab. During this session, the Integral team will facilitate a problem-solving exercise that gives you clarity and confidence to solve a product, design, or engineering problem. That's integral.io/convergence. Now, back to the show. All right, what is the question we have next?
Okay, we've got a good one here, and on a hot topic, vibe coding. Peerless Hat asks this question. I'm working with a founder right now who has some technical background, and they've been spending a lot of time vibe coding lately. They just jump into features without really syncing with the rest of the team or sharing a clear direction. It's becoming a pattern. Any advice on how to handle that?
I think vibe coding is a double-edged sword, especially for leaders on the team. And I'll talk about both sides in terms of the pros and the cons, and then ideally try and give you a little bit of framework of how to navigate both those. The pros of vibe coding are people who are post-technical, like this person that's being described in the question, are able to get back closer to the technology. And the more that you're able to bridge what you're seeing in the market and the problems that your customers are facing and what the technology is able to do, the more your instincts are able to fire off in terms of how you're able to differentiate and create a much more compelling solution for that market and the customers. So I think that is one big benefit to vibe coding, because you're not now having to go as the founder or someone who's closer to the customers or the market or the strategy, have to sit close to an engineer and wait for the cycle time for them to build something in order to realize what the software can and cannot do. Another benefit, I think, is that we're moving into a new realm here of AI and generative AI in our applications, not just in our software development process. And we need to change the way we think about architecting solutions for the problems that we want to solve for our customers that incorporates AI in the most useful way, how it can best be used. And vibe coding for me personally, as well as some of my peers who are founders, has been super helpful as a way to understand ourselves, what the capabilities as well as limitations of using generative AI models are in our applications, and when it's okay to traverse the non-determinism that comes with using generative AI, and when you want to stick to a more traditional rules engine and SQL database and so forth. So I think creating this new mental model is another benefit. In terms of the cons, I think it can be a really seductive distraction, where there are founders out there who spend a lot more time on vibe coding beyond which it is serving the bottleneck that they have in their system. So the bottlenecks that I talked about earlier are maybe the founder is too far post-technical, or the bottleneck is there isn't a good connection between customer insights and product or technical insights, and one person vibe coding all of it can really short circuit that constraint or bottleneck. Beyond the bottleneck, though, there's a series of risks that I think you're opening yourself up to. Unless this founder is looking to kind of run this business by themselves and not have any engineers and find ways to run this at production scale by themselves, at some point they're going to need to integrate these ideas into a broader product, into a broader team, in order to ultimately scale this in production. This founder also has other responsibilities beyond coming up with the business strategy or maybe the product strategy. It could be fundraising, it could be sales, it could be any other gamut of things that founders have to play in their multifaceted roles. And so not having a clear lens in terms of what your most critical constraints are and what your priorities are can lead to a risk, because I'll admit it can be very addicting to vibe code. I felt so powerful being able to do things that I didn't think I could do anymore, being pretty post-technical myself. And at the same time, realized that there was time that I ended up spending fine-tuning something that I had vibe coded that I could have been spending on something that was way more of a critical priority for the business, for my team. And so being disciplined, as always, in terms of what the most valuable thing you could be doing at any given time, and then finding ways to do that, even if it is vibe coding, I think is some of the risk that you can run into, where you're spending way more time developing the next iteration or vision of a product when you haven't quite maxed out the customer's value that you're developing for the existing version of the product. Another risk, I think, is that it can create a little bit of a tumultuous relationship that needs to be revisited between strategy and execution, or in this case, the founder and the engineering team, where sure, the engineering team is going to have some biases and assumptions going into it. And vibe coding can sometimes help the founder with understanding what's really possible or not. But using it as a solution versus developing more healthy communication and more healthy debates between the founder and the engineering team is where I think there's going to be a problem that's going to get worse over time if you're not stopping and having the uncomfortable conversations and challenging each other versus going away into a basement, figuring out the solution, slapping it on the team, and then forcing them to push into production leads to, I think, a pretty unhealthy workplace environment and culture that can have its own series of issues in the future. So overall, I think vibe coding can be very valuable, but be sure what the most value you can add is, and that vibe coding is the solution versus thinking that it is the solution to everything in front of you, because there is a very addicting capacity that it can bring. What's the next question that we have, Doug?
All right, the next question comes from user GuppyAn89, who asks, "Hey Ashok, big fan of the show. I'm on a platform team and we've been having this ongoing debate that I'm sure that you've run into. Should we keep investing in self-serve tools that give data scientists more autonomy, or lean harder into full service offerings where we actually embed our own data scientists into the service and give the customer an end-to-end solution to the business problem? The tricky part is some teams are super mature and they just want good APIs and docs, and others kind of expect a white glove experience. They want guidance, recommendation, even hands-on support. So it's not always clear who we should actually be prioritizing. Like, are we building for the most advanced user or the one who needs us the most? And how do we even decide who the customer is in that kind of internal ecosystem?
That is a great question. I think not having clarity in terms of a priority list for your customers and the problems that you solve can lead to this kind of confusion. And for your own teams, like Guppy Ann here sends in, and also for your customers, this is something that we had to solve for one of our OEM customers here. And the analogy that we used that made sense in the car world for them is the Scion versus Lexus one that we called about. And so a little bit of backstory there. Scion and Lexus are both brands, part of the Toyota Motor Corporation. And Lexus, of course, is like more of that full service, end-to-end, white glove type of brand, right? Someone who's buying a Lexus expects that everything's going to work just great. They're not necessarily car enthusiasts or folks who want to get under the hood and modify things. They expect that the dealership is going to treat them really well and solve all their problems so that they don't have to think about their car. On the other end of the spectrum, the same corporation has a brand called Scion, and Scion had a car called the TC that they made as a tuner car. And they made this sort of barely street legal, I would call it, in terms of having everything that it needed to sell a car, fully well knowing that the people buying it were going to rip out most of what they bought and upgrade the suspension, upgrade the wheels, upgrade the stereo system in many cases. So it was kind of wasteful for them to put anything that was more fancy or white glove into this car, knowing that their customer base didn't care about it. They cared about something that they could kind of have as a starting point to start doing mods on the car, right? So using this analogy, what we were able to do is help this customer with understanding who they wanted to serve. And I'm not saying that in their case, our customer realized that they had to do the Lexus stuff first before they could get to the Scion part of it. And that's because for their specific offering, they needed to help the customer base, the market in general, learn that this was a very viable approach to something that had a lot of value on the other end. And so they didn't want to risk having the customer's data scientists or a customer's engineers getting in the way as an uncertainty to proving and validating that this approach to a solution was really valuable. So they ultimately chose to go the white glove route. And then over time, as they developed stronger relationships with their customers, they allowed their customers further and further inside their black box, where maybe, in your case, you can use your own data scientists at first, prove out to your business customers or the business folks at your customers, I should say, that this is something that really works and helps their business run. And that's got to be answered before anyone cares about how it works. And once it's working and it's really viable as a solution, and at that point, people start to think about, okay, now that we've proven this thing works, how do we do it more efficiently? Maybe we don't need their data scientists and it's more cost effective for us to use our data scientists. And at that point, you can start to transition some of this work that your data scientists were doing and train their data scientists. All the while, number one, validating that between the tool and the data scientist, it's highly usable. So initially, your data scientists are going to be providing a lot of feedback, if asked the right way, on making that tool more usable for the data scientists and the fewest workarounds for your own team. And ultimately, building something that seems really intuitive and seamless for an external data scientist. This is going to take some amount of discipline because when push comes to shove, we oftentimes push the workarounds to the humans as part of the service as opposed to the product itself. Just remember that you're accumulating debt there, and the more you can modify into the product, the more someone who's third party that's using it is going to find it very intuitive to use. One way to kind of short circuit this or bridge it is maybe partnering with a data science company to use it, and give them this tool and partner with them to provide the end-to-end solution. If you're short on data scientists, or if your company's not really set up to have a services wing or the amount of cost that goes into maintaining a bench of data scientists, maybe you can borrow data scientists from a partner company. And the other thing I like about having an external partner use it, even though it's internal to the solution to your customer or part of that black box where your customer doesn't necessarily know who's providing the tool and who's providing the data scientist. The thing that's also nice about this is that this data scientist is external to your company. So they're going to have much higher expectations of the tool than your internal data scientist is. And your customer's data scientists are going to have even higher expectations. So you're creating sort of a dip your toe in roadmap that you can slowly ease your way into building a really robust self-service tool, starting with a full service tool. Of course, this was specific to that customer, and they knew that prioritizing the full service customers as well as that problem was a much more valuable problem that they wanted to tackle first compared to the scale that comes from building full service. And it made a ton of sense. So rather than copying the answer that they did, hopefully I was able to provide you with some of the thinking behind the sequencing so that you can choose which one makes most sense to you. Thank you for joining me on the Convergence podcast today. Subscribe to the Convergence podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your content. If you're listening and found this helpful, please give us a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button and tell me what you think about what you heard today.